Good morning or afternoon or evening, everyone, again. Okay, so yeah, this is the second essay, sort of largely generally interested in the sociology of sciences. So here we're looking again at these challenges to scientific objectivity. So from N.R. Hanson, we get this claim that even something as fundamental as observation, something as fundamental as seeing something, actually involves a whole host of considerations and issues larger than merely the biological process of sight. So this is essentially, Hanson's goal here is to show how our environment, our history, our background, prior knowledge, all of these external factors affect what we see and how we see it, what we observe and how we observe it. So what I want this to do is act as a sort of jumping off point for the types of discussions that we're going to have well, really starting on Monday for the rest of the semester, these issues of gender and race in the sciences. Um, yeah, so what we'll do today then is going to be like a general discussion of this, and then we're going to look at specifically how our background, history, standpoint, prejudices, and biases regarding issues of race and gender affect how science is done, whose voices we listen to, what observations are made, and how they're interpreted. So this is sort of like the general discussion for what is going to go on from this point on in the rest of the semester. Yeah, just some bookkeeping things. So just as a reminder, the next response paper 5, should be uploaded to Blackboard no later than 11:59 this coming Monday. So I'll remind you of that again during Monday's lecture, but once, this is the last lecture you're going to need to do that. Or need to have to finish that, I guess is what I mean. So yeah, after this lecture on Hanson, you'll have everything to answer response paper 5. So the first part of the question asks how science might be less objective than we think it to be. So there you can really go, a few different ways, looking at the stuff from today on Hanson, certainly the stuff on Merton and the Matthew effect from last class, even going back to Loudon and Lakatos and even maybe Thomas Kuhn. So there's a lot of ways you can handle that. The second part of the question, how something as fundamental as observation might be affected by, us, broadly speaking, that's going to largely come from today's lecture on Hanson. So if anybody has any questions on anything, feel free to shoot me an email, set up some time to meet over the weekend. But yeah, next response paper 5, due by the end of the day on Monday the 13th. So just make sure you have that done. And again, I'll remind you again on Monday's lecture as well. So, okay, well then, without further ado, so, yeah, N.R. Hanson, Norwood Russell Hanson, philosopher of science, relatively contemporary. So, yeah, 1950s and 1960s. So these are his birth and death dates. We'll get to that in a second. Yeah, American philosopher of science again. Yeah, studied extensively. So started U Chicago, Columbia, Oxford, Cambridge University. He Yeah, he actually returned to the U.S. He founded the first department of the philosophy of science at Indiana University in the 1950s. So he got a Fulbright grant to start this, I believe it was. Comes back from Cambridge and founds this as like a philosophical or historical examination of the sciences, right? So largely building on some of the same work that Kuhn was doing at Berkeley at the same time. Yeah, so. I think I had mentioned before, Matthew Lund, one of our tenure professors at Rowan, actually wrote a book on N.R. Hanson. So he's sort of like our resident philosopher of science guy, specifically with Hanson and specifically with Hanson's work on observation. Yeah, N.R. Hanson is a really interesting figure in philosophy of science. Yeah, I mean, he sort of looks like the standard, academic philosopher in the same vein as maybe, Larry Loudon or Lakatos or these types of people. If you read his biography, though, Hanson's a really interesting figure. He starts out, prior to when he was in high school specifically, he was a trumpet prodigy. He was taught under sort of these preeminent classical and jazz musicians. He actually played trumpet at Carnegie Hall at one point. He ends up being drafted during in World War II. He was originally drafted into the Coast Guard. He later enrolls in the United States Marines. He was a fighter pilot with the United States Marines, I believe on the Western Front. Yeah, he comes back after World War II with, thousands of flight hours under his belt. He teaches for a while. He actually taught John Kerry, of all people. So he was one of John Kerry's teachers at flight school. And decides to go into philosophy at this point, right? So like he comes back, he takes this GI Bill after being this Marine fighter pilot and goes into philosophy of science. Yeah, and again, so this sort of leads back to, if you check out his birth and death dates, he died a young man. He was in his early 40s when he was actually flying his plane, this Bearcat that he owned, upstate New York, I think around Ithaca, and I think it was like heavy fog, and he crashes and he dies. He was, I believe, the only person on the flight. But yeah, he died in a plane crash in 1967. So yeah, really sort of a tragic end to a very, very interesting life. So yeah, so you see his influence here with this stuff on observation, right? So what's sort of Hanson's objective here? What does he want to do? Well, I mean, essentially, what he wants to demonstrate is that seeing is more than the biological process of sight. That to really see something involves a whole host of factors, not just what is happening with our eyeballs. Right? So, yeah, he's sort of say like observation is different from just having the actual biological process of the light hitting our eyes. So to really see something involves like a whole host of factors, and it can't just be reduced to, if you have the properly functioning visual faculties, you have really seen something, or you have seen something. I'm going to say it involves a whole host of what we would broadly say are interpretive factors, but he wouldn't like that term, but that's sort of how we look at it. Yeah, so he starts out with this discussion of Johannes Kepler and Tycho Brahe. And he says, when they watch the sunrise, do they see the same thing? If you had Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler standing side by side, watching a sunrise, would they actually observe the same thing? So, who are these people, right? Tycho Brahe they're both astronomers. Tycho Brahe was probably one of the most well-known geocentric astronomers. So, still working under the assumption that the Earth is the stable center of the universe, prior to that heliocentric paradigm shift that we've been talking about. Johannes Kepler then was one of the first geocentric scientists. Right? He influenced both Copernicus and Galileo. He was really one of the first to suggest or to plot the motion of the planets, and says, hypothetically, if the sun were the center of the universe, or at least the center of our solar system, rather than us, what would the rotations of the planets look like? Now, both were incredibly successful astronomers. This goes back to this idea that like the geocentric view didn't get everything wrong, right? He was able to use the geocentric model to predict comets, to predict eclipses, to make a lot of successful predictions with the sciences, even if he got his fundamentals completely wrong as to where we stood with relation to the center of the universe. So yeah, both were incredibly successful, incredibly knowledgeable astronomers. And what Hanson asks is, when both watch a sunrise, are they seeing the same thing? Do they see the same thing when the sun rises? And yeah, we intuitively want to say yes. And that's sort of Hanson's point here, right? We want to say, of course they do. They're both standing there. And, if their eyes are properly functioning, the same photons emitted by the sun, the sky, and the horizon, they're all the same, right? They're getting the same input from the world. And if both of their eyes work the same, then their eyes are receiving that in the same way. These photons are the same, and they're passing through the cornea, iris, and lens of each man, and hitting the retinas in exactly the same way, and they're being interpreted into sort of these nerve impulses in the brain that create a figure or a scene. Provided that all this is properly functioning in both Brahe and Kepler, well, yeah, we want to say that they see the same thing. But Hansen says the way we just described that, right, as the photons coming off of the light coming off of the sun or being emitted by the sun, being reflected off of the sky and the landscape and the horizon line and all of this. It can't be the and then how it hits their eyes and passes through their cornea and their iris to the retina. This can't be the whole story when it comes to seeing something. We can't say that that's all that seeing is. And he says, like, is this all we mean when we say we've seen something? And do we claim that we've seen something every time this biological process occurs? And his answer is no, right? He says, well, what if I'm distracted or under the influence of some drug, right? If I'm hallucinating, is it appropriate to say that I've seen something just because it passes, the photons hit my eyes? If I think I'm seeing something else, right? Um, I'm hallucinating, I don't know, like a big pink elephant standing in front of me right now in front of a white wall. Well, clearly the pink elephant isn't there, so the photons off of the white wall have to be passing through my eyes, but it's not right to say that I saw it. Um, I think all of us have had that experience of, when you're driving home from somewhere, whether it's work or school, it's a drive that you have made a lot of times. So it's somewhere you regularly travel. Maybe that's a parent or a loved one's house, or yeah, work or school or something. You sort of get lost in your own thoughts, and all of a sudden you're like pulling into your driveway, right? Or you're parallel parking outside of your house or whatnot. Um, and you sort of are like, wait, how did I get here, right? Um, you get this idea of like, well, I hope I didn't run any red lights. Um, it seems like in those instances, right, you got home, you didn't hit anyone, you presumably didn't run a red light or a stop sign, you didn't get pulled over for reckless driving. So presumably you stopped at every stop sign, you stopped at red lights and went when the light was green. You didn't hit any cars. Um, but is it right to say that you saw them? Did you see everything on your way home, right? Um, yeah, what you're doing now, if you're focusing on this computer screen, there's clearly things in your peripheral vision, but do you actually see them? Now you're paying attention to them, so now you do. But that light passes through your eyes in the same way as the sunrise for Kepler or Brahe, but is it something that you actually see? He used the example like someone in a coma. I'm not sure if that's the best example that you could actually say like the biological process is secure, but I get what he's saying. Like if you flash a light and someone's eyes is in a coma, the eye reacts to light. That at least that part of the biological process is working. But is that enough to say that they see it? And he says, well, no. So this is his first part, that seeing is in some sense more than just a physical state of affairs, more than just a causal process of my eye, my brain, electrical impulses, and light passing through my eyes. The experience of seeing something is more than that. It requires sort of conditions, both external conditions, like the light passing through my eyes in the same way, and things about me, things about who I am and what I'm doing that allow for sight. He says that this is his, I mean, if you're looking for a bumper sticker quote for this essay, page 434's got it. There's more to seeing than meets the eyeball. This the idea that people see, not their eyes. So the idea of sight involves a whole host of processes in me and not just my eyeballs. Right? It's a cute little thing. Anyway, right, so he says, part of his point is like if you asked Brahe and Kepler what they see, they would probably answer differently. I mean, not probably, they definitely would answer differently. What do you see, Tycho Brahe? What do you see, Johannes Kepler? Well, Brahe would say, like, I see a moving sun, right? I see a sun moving into a position where it's visible from my stationary position. I see the movement of our celestial sphere to begin a new day or whatever. Kepler would say, I see the sun again. I am now in a position to see the sun again. The Earth has rotated into a position where the sun is now again visible, right? They would describe what they see differently, regardless of the fact that the biological process is the same in both men. And he says, if you ask them to describe what they see, like to actually describe like what's in front of their eyes, not to say like what it is, the sun rising, but to say what do you see, they'd probably describe it in much the same. They'd say like, well, I see a partial circle that is a bright orange, yellow, white circle that is getting larger over a horizontal horizon line. And I see blue behind it to the top and maybe green below if you're looking at it over a field. And his point is like if you ask them to draw what they see, they'd both draw the same sunrise. We're going to return to this, right? So a common response then, if they both would draw it the same way or describe it the same way, if you asked them to describe it as just like colors and shapes, is that they do actually see the same thing, but they interpret it differently. If you ask them what they are actually seeing to describe what's in front of them, they would say, you know, yellow half circle, blue on top, horizontal line, green underneath it, whatever, right? But if you ask them what it is that they're seeing, most people would say what you're asking then for is an interpretation. So there you're asking for Brahe to say, what I am seeing is the sun moving into a position where I can see it again. Johannes Kepler would say, what I am seeing is the stationary sun that I am now in a position to see again based on the movements of the Earth, right? This is what Hanson wants to argue against, though. He wants to say, like, this isn't just interpreting things differently. They actually do see something different. So for Hanson, this seeing differently isn't just a matter of having different interpretations of the same observation. Something else is going on there. So he says, there's more to our seeing than just sense data, than just what is in front of my senses. Um, you know, we're not just interpreting neutral or objective sense data, that our history and background and standpoint, our knowledge about what we think we're seeing actually affects what we see, not just how we interpret it. So yeah, so this is his first example. This Necker cube is what they're called. I never actually knew before. Um, Starting to teach philosophy of science that these had a name, right? I've certainly doodled them in a million notebooks over the course of, primary school, undergraduate, and graduate school. But I never knew they had an actual name before. But yeah, these are Necker cubes, right? And I think most of us have drawn these at some point in our life, and you can see them in two different ways, right? You can either see, this square here as the front square, right? There's going to be a lot of drawing with this awful little cursor this class, so forgive me for that. You can either see that square as the one in the front, or you can see this square as the one in the front. Right? So either then, if you see the bottom square as the one in the front, you're looking down at the object. If you're looking up at if you see the top square as the one in the front, you're looking sort of up at the object, right? So we asked, well, which do you see in the foreground? And I think if you're doing it like I am, they're sort of switching right now as you stare at them, right? 1 second, the bottom one's in the front, 1 second, the top one's in the front, and your eyes are making that transition as to which way the lines go and all of this. And he asks, like, is this a matter of interpretation? And he says, no, like, this can't just be a difference of interpretation, whether or not I see the bottom one in the foreground or the top one in the foreground. For one reason, he says, it seems like interpretation takes time, takes thought, a cognitive process, right? If I say, what's your interpretation of um, Shakespeare's Othello, right? You might say something like, well, this interpretation I have is like, beware of friends who are treacherous, or beware of jealousy, or something like that as an interpretation. If I asked you, what's your interpretation of, my wife just got finished watching the second season of You on Netflix. What's your interpretation of this? I'm not entirely sure what my interpretation of that is. I think it's very compelling, but it's kind of odd. Or it's weird the way they subvert the idea of a protagonist, but and who they get you to root for. But again, those are issues of interpretation that take time and thought, right? Whether you see the bottom square in the foreground or the top square in the foreground doesn't seem to be a matter that takes any time or any cognitive thought. I just see one and then I see the other. It just sort of switches, right? He says something about like there can't be an immediate or an instantaneous interpretation. So it's not revolving around anything that I'm doing cognitively or that I have to explain or think about or that takes time to interpret, right? I merely see it as one or the other. Likewise, this old young woman. Now, if we were in class, this is one of those things that is frustrating that we're not in class. If we were in class, I could ask you who sees one and not the other, so we could all be on the same page here. But it does take a while. So if you have trouble seeing I wonder how I can do this. Oh, there's an eraser. Cool. Okay, so if you have trouble seeing we'll start with the old woman. So if you're looking for the old woman, this here is her nose. This is her eyeball here. right? And this is her mouth and her chin down here, right? And then this all up here is like a hat or like a cowl or something. So I'm hoping that everybody sees the old woman there. All right, let's try to erase all of this now. Oh, there we go. Cool. We can just click on it, click on it, click on it. Now, if you're looking for the young woman, if they're, and again, don't feel bad if you can only see one or the other. There are, I would say at least half the class every semester can only see one, either the old woman or the young woman. And it's funny when you talk to the class, the ones who only see uh, the old woman can't see the young woman, and they look at the people who can see the young woman and say, how can you not see an old woman? And the people who see the young woman but not the old woman look at the other one and say, how can you not see the young woman? Right? So again, don't feel bad. If you're looking for the young woman, then what we've got here is, and highlighter. Okay, cool. What we got here is like she's looking away. So this is her eye here, and she's looking backwards this way. I've never actually done this before like this, so this is going to be interesting. Right, so she's glancing away from you. So this over here is like the back of her head, right? So this becomes the line of her chin, her jawline, I'm sorry, right? This is her ear up here. So her eyes aren't really visible, and this little thing over here is her nose, right? So she's looking away from you. This is her neckline there, and she's wearing this sort of coat, right? So she's looking away from you. So this is her hair right here, right? But again, her face is not her eyes, her front of her face is not visible. She's looking away from you, away from the camera, so to speak. Right? So you can either see a young woman or an old woman. Let's erase it again, back to the beginning. And I hope everybody saw that. If not, yeah, shoot me an email. We can try to figure out another way to, or I'm sure you could find a video online that explains it better than my drawings here if you were interested. But yeah, let me know if you can't see any of either of them. So yeah, but so we can either see it as a young woman or an old woman, and now hopefully you can see both of them, and you can sort of switch which you see in the same way that you switch which block was in front with the Necker cube, right? And depending on how we view them, the lines sort of come together in different ways, right? So if I see the young woman, for instance, this line follows here for her neckline all the way down like that. So all of this is sort of connected into one line. But if I see her as the old woman, right, then this line, which starts all the way up here, goes around and then connects to that line there to make a nose, right? So they adhere differently. Depending on what we want to focus on, the young woman or the old woman, we look at things or we ignore them. So for one thing, with the old woman, her chin is terribly out of proportion. Right? If I see the young woman, it makes sense that this is like a bust line of her jacket, right? But if it's an old woman, that chin just seems like weirdly proportioned to the rest of her. It juts out too far. But we overlook that when we say we see the old woman. I'm presuming that this thing here is supposed to be, well, it's clearly the old woman's mouth, but it's supposed to be a necklace on the young woman. But it just looks odd for a necklace. Likewise with the old woman, right? This thing here doesn't really look like an eyeball as so much as an ear. It looks much more like an ear than an eyeball. But if I already said that this thing here is a nose, right? Then this has to be an eyeball because if that's the nose, that's where the eye should be. So depending on who we see, the lines cohere in certain ways. I ignore the fact that this doesn't look like an eyeball very much or that the chin is too long. We focus on and we ignore difference. So this is his point, right? So he shows us this picture next. I had no idea what this was before I read it. I sort of glanced at the figures before I went down the page. And until you read what he says that it is, this bear hugging a tree, you don't really know, right? It could be anything. Someone had said it looks like beetles on a branch, crawling up a branch. It could be, a whole host of things. I don't know. It's a Rorschach test, whatever you see there. But he says it's a bear hugging a tree. And you're like, oh, of course it is. You just can't see the bear. So these are its paws, right? The bear is on the back of the tree, and its paws are like hugging the tree, and all you're seeing are the paws on the front of the tree. And once I see that, it totally makes sense. The lines adhere to each other in very specific ways, right? This here becomes empty space when he says it's a bear hugging a tree, right? This becomes a tree, right? And these become the paws of a bear, So what happens then too, and this is, I think, more to his point, is once he says bear hugging a tree, that's all I see here. I can't interpret it as anything else now. Now I just see a bear hugging a tree. And you're like, well, yeah, obviously. The description seems natural. Of course it's a bear hugging a tree, right? So this is sort of what he wants to discuss. This idea that once we see it in some way, I treat that observation as natural or neutral. Obviously, that's a bear. Obviously, this thing here is either an antelope or a bird. And we forget the original context that we saw it. We forget that it was ambiguous at one point until someone in authority like Hanson said that's a bear hugging a tree. This is going to become much more important next week when we talk about issues of gender in the sciences. We treat gender biases or stereotypes as natural when we don't realize that like they are as socially constructed and arbitrary as someone like Hanson saying that's a bear hugging a tree. Let's look at this photo, this drawing now, right? So what is this? Well, it could be a couple of things. It's really just a couple sets of lines, right? He narrows it down to, is it a bird or an antelope, right? So if it's a bird, right? If it's a bird, this is the beak, right? And the bird is looking off this way, right? And then if it's an antelope, these two spiky things are its horns, right? And, sorry, erasing. And this thing over here is its nose and its snout, and I guess its mouth would be in there somewhere, and it's looking off this way. God, that's awful. But you get the idea. Right? So, is it a bird or is it an antelope? Well, it could be both here. It could be nothing, right? We don't know. Yeah, without any context, we have no idea. If it's just on a blank page like this, I don't know. Yeah, it could be a bird. It could be an antelope. Uh, could be, I don't know what else it could be. It could be something else. Whatever. Right? But yeah, in certain contexts, though, if we ask what this thing is, we might see it very right. So yeah, he does this. Like, do you see a bird now? Well, yeah, right. I see a bird among other birds. Now it coheres in a certain way based on that context. Among other birds, it seems to fit right in. You say, of course, it's a bird, right? Okay, how about this? Do you see an antelope now? Well, yeah. In the context of other drawings where there's other antelope-like figures, it certainly fits right in equally as an antelope, right? In each context, it seems to be part of the same thing. So this has sort of implications for confirmation bias, perhaps. If I've seen confirming answers maybe 100 times in a row, the next one might look the same in the same context. So yeah, each environment sort of causes us, and this is what's important for confirmation bias, to sort of overlook or explain away or focus on or accentuate certain aspects of what we're watching, what we're looking. So yeah, so if we let's put it like this, right? The top is the figure without any context. On the left is the figure in front of a bunch of birds. On the right is the figure, or not in front of. On the left is the figure amongst birds. On the right is the figure amongst antelope, right? And you can see that certain things don't make sense for both interpretations, different things, right? So if you say on the left, this is a bird among birds, okay? Well, look at the other beaks of these birds here specifically. Here's a good example. The beaks are, in some sense, like the top and the bottom beak, if that's what they're supposed to be, are both curved towards each other, right? So that they look like a mouth shutting. They make a V, right? They're sort of curved in the same way. So eventually, they sort of they form this, they're sort of well, they're both one's concave, one convex. In any event, you see what I mean here. They're curved. They're both curved in towards the middle of the mouth. Look at the beak, so to speak, on the initial figure. Look at it up here. They're not curved in the same way, right? They're both curved in the same direction, whereas the other birds, they're both curved inward. Both curves here are curved down. So we explain that away, right? We don't pay attention to that. When we say that's a bird among birds, we ignore that difference between it and other birds, right? Let's erase all of this. Likewise, look at the heads. The heads of the birds all have a definitive break between the end of the head and the start of the beak. It's most prominent right here, right? Now, take away that. Do you see any break up here in this head or in this drawing? No. You can even see it here, but you didn't pay attention to it when you saw it amongst birds. You just said, sure, it looks like a bird amongst birds, and you ignored that difference. Look over at when it's among antelope. Is it an antelope among antelope? Well, it certainly looks like it, right? Um, but there are subtle differences here as well. First of all, here, what are, should be horns in this, look how long and thin they are. Now they're both going in the same direction as his, but they're much different they're much more elongated versus the head. The ratio of the size to the size of the head, they're much thinner as well. Look at his up here. Say his, geez. We're going to talk about gender issues next week, but look at this figure at the top. They're not the same at all. They're very different. Also, if you look at the necks of these antelope go back sloping towards the body. You can see it most prominently in this one in the back here. His goes straight down. So again, we explain away differences when we see it in a certain context. So, Hanson talks about this. I think one of his aims here is something like confirmation bias, that over the course of 100 confirming results, maybe we overlook things that are different because we've seen it so many times. We say, of course, it's the same thing as a bird or an antelope, and we overlook features that might be different, that might be disconfirming, perhaps. So, what changes? What changes is what, broadly speaking, is called our standpoint, right? The context in which we see something. Maybe the history of our observations, how many times I've seen it amongst birds versus amongst antelope in that example. What else we observe at the same time, what we observed in the past, right? So all of these affect this. Check out, so I put up 3 videos to watch in conjunction with this lecture. The first is this clip from the BBC on the McGurk effect. So go ahead and watch that. You can come back to this whenever. Cool. Neat stuff, right? That's a really good. So this is one of those things that I wish I was in the classroom with all of you to see your reaction to these, because these are really fun. But yeah, you could see there that like this is what's known as ocular centrism, which is a great name. Basically means the primacy of visual perception. So what you saw in that video was we see overriding what we hear, right? And the thought is, I think that the speaker, the scientist, goes into detail here that like sight is the primary way that we navigate the world. So when our senses tell us different things, when our visual sense faculties say that looks like the mouth making an F sound, but our ears say, nah, I hear a B, we literally override our auditory senses because of this ocular centrism. The sense of sight is primary. It says, no, you know what? I got this. It's an F, and just changes what we observe. Again, this is an interpretation, right? It's just what we hear. And I think the most interesting thing there is that you can't hear anything else. He says, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I still hear the same thing there, right? Doesn't matter how well you know the experiment, how well you know what's going to happen. You can't help but hear a fa instead of a ba. Check out the second clip, this sine wave speech. Again, I'll wait. That one's really cool too, right? Yeah, so I played this again um, before I did this lecture. I was just checking to make sure the video still worked and everything off of YouTube. And so I didn't teach philosophy of science last year. I taught a few sections of philosophy of art and ethics, and well, it doesn't matter what else, you don't care. But yeah, I didn't teach philosophy of science. So like I hadn't heard that in over a year at that point. And the first time you hear it, you can't really tell what anything is. I can understand it perfectly. Even not hearing the actual, audio, unaltered audio for over a year. And again, this isn't interpretation. It's just basically like our history affects what we observe. The order of observations matter. Right? The second time I hear that sine wave speech, I can hear speech in it when I couldn't the first time because my brain has a way to make sense of it now. This third clip is really cool. This just came out this year. So maybe some of you are familiar with this idea of this clip about brainstorm. So it's this little figure thing, and it supposedly says either brainstorm or green needle, depending on what you're thinking of at the time. So it's going to play it a few times at the beginning of the clip. Think brainstorm, you'll hear brainstorm. Think green needle before it plays, you'll hear green needle. Here's what's really weird. Take them and combine them. So think brain needle, you'll hear brain needle. Think green storm. You'll hear green storm. So yeah, play this. There's an explanation from Reddit at the end. I'm less concerned with that than just like the listening to it and what you hear based on what you think. Cool. So yeah, that one's really neat. Yeah, so what we're thinking affects what we observe. So what's happening in our heads affects like what we hear in this case. So all of these are these really interesting examples, right? So again, I don't think any of these, the McGurk effect, the sine wave speech, or brainstorm, is a history of interpreting what we're hearing differently, right? It all seems to be we're hearing it differently, right? We are perceiving something different based on, in the first instance, what I am seeing affects what I'm hearing, right? Because if you don't look at it, you will only hear ba. In the sine wave speech, the order of events, my history, my background, my standpoint affect what I hear. And with brainstorm, what I think about affects what I'm hearing, right? This is not a matter of interpretation. So yeah, he said, how we view an object or a scene is going to be affected by our own experiences, our history, our knowledge, our background. So he talks about, yeah, this physicist and the layperson who both have the same sense data when viewing this X-ray tube that he has the diagram of at 439. They don't actually see the same thing, he says. One sees a tool that serves a purpose, and the other one sees a foreign object based on their own background and history. In the same way, a musician and a non-musician are going to hear the same note, but only the musician is going to hear an out-of-tune note. So yeah, this is idea, this is sort of the thesis of what Russell is pointing, or sorry, what Hanson is pointing out here. The observation of anything X is shaped by our prior knowledge and experience with things like that, things relevantly similar to it. So for Brahe, to see a sunrise is to see our satellite beginning its daily motion across the sky. For Kepler, it's to see the Earth return to its same position in the Earth's daily rotation. And this is what each of them say when they observe. So unless we're asking for strict sense data, and this is interesting. So yeah, if we ask them to describe what they're seeing as merely just shapes and colors, or draw it, they would say the same thing. I see a yellow ball, I see blue in the background at the top, green at the bottom, and a line in between them, or whatever. But Hanson points out something interesting when we use these descriptions. So when do we use descriptions like that? We only describe things like that when we don't know what we're seeing. Think about it. If you see an animal in the woods, right? If you know what it is, you just say, I saw a deer, or I saw a raccoon, or I saw a bear, right? But if you don't know what you're seeing, if someone said, what'd you see out there in the woods? You said, I don't know. Well, how do you describe it? Well, you describe it then as I was kind of big and brown, about 7 foot tall, if you're describing a bear, right? When you have no prior knowledge of it or experience with it is the only time you use those descriptions. If you saw Bigfoot, you'd be like, I don't know what it was. It was big and hairy, right? You're describing it like that because you have no prior experience or knowledge of it. The only time we use those types of descriptions. So observation of X is shaped by prior knowledge and experience with X. What we observe is always affected by our standpoint, our own history, our wants, our needs, and desires. If we're talking about Merton here with the Matthew effect, our own biases and prejudices. This is what we're going to go into next week on our assumptions and preconceived notions about things. So this is going to be our focus going forward. What we want to do then is look at next week how our experiences with gender and gender roles, how our uh, sort of history and standpoint and who we are with respect to gender affects our interpretations and what we see and what we interpret and how we do science, right? And our prejudices and biases with gender is how we view women in the sciences and how we make observations of scientific data based on gendered norms or gendered observations. So that's where we'll go from here. Yeah, so any questions, shoot me an email, set up some time to meet. Once again, you should have everything now to answer response number 5. That's due by the end of the day on Monday the 13th, so by 11:59 p.m. Upload to Blackboard. Everything should already be up for that. Yeah, by the time you're reading this, it will already have gone live for submissions, I think. So if you have any problems submitting it, shoot me an email and let me know. I'll remind you again on Monday because it won't be due till after our class. But yeah. All right, everyone. Well, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, stay safe, and I'll see you again on Monday.